Live. There we go.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session on the Oxford English Faculty Virtual Open Day. The obligatory apologies that we are virtual. We would love to have you here in Oxford, but I also know that for some people it's more possible just to drop in and put your toe in the water because it's online rather than traveling, some of you from far afield. So welcome anyway, and I hope you have a good time finding out about Oxford and about the English faculty. So my name's Emma Smith. I teach mostly Shakespeare and Renaissance studies at Hertford College, which is an extremely fine college you should look up on the as part of the Open Day visits. And here with me is Alfie, who works as our access officer in the faculty, and he has been responsible for setting all this up and for toggling between Slido and YouTube and Zoom and everything to make this work. Alfie, do you want to say anything about asking questions?
Yes, so during this live stream, we're going to roughly do it half an hour for Emma to present, and then we'll have a period for 15 minutes questions at the end. But if you would like to leave your comments in YouTube comments, your questions as they come to you, we'll get to them at the end as opposed to cutting through the presentation. Yeah, so over to you, Emma.
That's great, thanks. And do ask questions. I'm going to be talking about Shakespeare in some quite general terms, because obviously you're all familiar with and you're all discussing different texts. And it might be that it's through the questions that you want to make the connection between the more overarching themes that I'm trying to present and the particular plays that you're studying. So I'm really happy for you to ask me, well, how does this relate to Othello or something like that? We could do that. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we are. Great. And what I'm talking about today is context. I'm thinking about the historical context that you're supposed to bring if you're studying A-level, that you're supposed to bring to your study of Shakespeare. And what I want to do is just to sort of set out some of the ways in which I think historical context is a bit more complicated, but also just a bit more interesting, maybe, than we've sometimes thought. So quite a lot of what I see in work by really great A-level students is really a sort of mapping of the history and the play that they're studying, so that there's a sort of one-to-one correspondence. And we might call this a kind of reflection model, so that the play reflects historical attitudes, say, to women or to power or to government or democracy or something like that. And I suppose through this talk, I want to just disrupt that model of reflection a bit and to think that maybe the best verb for thinking about the relationship between Shakespeare, the Shakespeare play you're studying, and the historical context is not reflection, but is something else, a little bit more questioning. And I want to do that really by thinking about our own period. If you were a sort of student of the 400 years on from now, and you were looking at our culture, our popular television, our popular film, TikTok, those kinds of things, what sense would you get of the society that produced those? And I think immediately we see that, we can think that's actually quite a complicated relationship. I mean, for one thing, we could say, if you were doing your research 400 years hence and watching a lot of television crime, you'd say, God, women got murdered a lot, didn't they? Weren't women murdered a lot in Britain in 2021? Now, the fact that every TV crime or detective series has a murdered woman in it does tell us something about our society, but it's not directly that there are lots of murders of women. There are far too many murders of women, but you see what I mean? It's not exactly reflecting that. It's saying something about our society, but something that's a little bit more difficult to tease out. And that's the kind of thing that I want to look at in Shakespeare. And if we get going, I think you'll see a bit more where I'm headed. So the first, I'm going to do it under these sort of 4 headings, 4 kind of precepts, and I'm going to try and talk to these precepts. Shakespeare writes entertainment, not documentary. That's the first thing I want to say about Shakespeare's works. So Shakespeare is, as you probably know, part of an investor in a really profitable and effective entertainment industry that is the London theatre at the end of the 16th and into the 17th century. So, I mean, he's not quite sort of Cameron Mackintosh or someone like that, but he is investing in a commercially successful entertainment business. And in order to sort of keep that business going, he is in part, this isn't the only thing he's doing, but it's an important part nevertheless, he's producing entertainments that people will enjoy. You probably don't go to the cinema. You probably don't go to the cinema. I could just put a full stop there. None of us done that for ages, have we? But you probably don't do that when you do, or you probably don't choose your TV or Netflix viewing because something is going to give you a sermon or tell you how to live. Who's interested in that? I'm not interested in that. And nor were people who went to the theatre at the end of the 16th century. So sometimes when we give a kind of moral view or say, what was Shakespeare trying to say with this? We're sort of presupposing that the people who were willing to pay their money to go to an exciting topical entertainment industry were actually wanting to get, I don't know, moral advice or life advice or something. Now, they may have got that, again, in a sort of slightly disguised way. All our cultural products are telling us something about the kind of people we ought to be or ought not to be in some subtle way. If you watch a lot of Hollywood films, if you watch a lot of Hollywood rom-coms, you'll see from this selection here, you sort of, to be a romantic hero, you need to be, dark with a little bit of stubble. If you want to be a romantic heroine, you've got to have really fantastic teeth. You can't really be black in this world. So these are ways that our entertainment does give us messages about how we should behave and what's acceptable and what isn't in some quite difficult ways. But again, it's not an absolutely straightforward relationship. It's not straightforwardly giving us kind of moral lessons. So that's part of this point here. The entertainment element of Shakespeare's plays means that I think that his first priority is to be entertaining, to give people plays which are in some ways familiar and in some ways just sort of different enough to make people feel they're seeing something new. Shakespeare's plays, as we're going to come on to, are heavily generic. That's to say, they operate within certain forms already. They're ringing the changes on things that he knows audiences are already keen to see. So those entertaining plays are not necessarily primarily delivering a moral or didactic message. And the other thing about entertainment is that it's not documentary, it's not gritty, it's not realist, it's not giving a portrait of contemporary London. None of Shakespeare's plays is set, possibly Merry Wives of Windsor, but I would be really surprised if any of you are studying that. None of Shakespeare's plays is set in contemporary England. He's not interested in reflecting directly back to people the world, their own world. He is really interested in using the theatre to take them away from that world to a sort of fairy tale place or a fantastical place or an exotic place, somewhere where the normal rules don't apply. And the idea that you can do things in theatre that you can't do in real life or that are absolutely at odds with what happens in real life, I think is a really interesting notion of what the space of the theatre represented in Shakespeare in England. So let's just give one example. I think if you were to walk down Cheapside, the main thoroughfare in early modern London, as a man dressed in women's clothes, you'd probably be beaten up. If you were to come on the stage of the Globe Theatre as a man dressed in women's clothes, you would be applauded, you would be able to be a bit saucy. You'll be able to flirt with men and women in the audience. They would laugh, they would enjoy that ambiguity. Now that tells us something about the theatre, and it perhaps tells us something about people's desires for what they can do in their entertainment that they can't do in their real life. But again, it doesn't reflect directly onto everyday life in Shakespeare's London. So, and just before we finish on this, I think that sometimes we inherit a pretty snooty view of Shakespeare from much, much earlier critics. In the 18th century, people, so in the 1700s was the first sort of century in which people really started to think about Shakespeare not as an enjoyable entertainer, if you like, but as a subject of serious study. And editors and all kinds of individuals, even people who were performing the plays on the stage, wanted to investigate their historical and linguistic aspects and wanted to produce Shakespeare as a modern classic, an important, valuable work, literary work, as much for reading as for performance. And part of that work, I think, was to suggest that really, if he could have done, Shakespeare would have been a poet, or that which was the highest sort of literary form of the 17th century. So he would have written for himself and for his elite audience, his elite readers, but because of the time when he lived, so this is all the kind of 18th century kind of take on this, because of the time when he lived, he had to sort of slum it a bit by writing for the theatre. And, you know, that's a bit regrettable, but we can still find the brilliant bits of Shakespeare, particularly if we take out the comedy or the stuff that's for the groundlings. So you may have come across this argument in different forms. And what that argument, I think, suggests is that Shakespeare's theatricality and his commitment to entertainment is something artistically suspect, or something less valuable than the kind of poetic work that we might all have come to appreciate through the kinds of study of Shakespeare that we make now. I don't think that's what Shakespeare was like at all. I think Shakespeare loved being part of the theatre. We've talked quite a lot over the last few months about what did Shakespeare do during the plague in his own time. And one of the things we know he did in the plague of 1593 is that he wrote 2 long poems, essentially for print, to be circulated among readers, to be sold and to make their money and make their impact by being read. So quite the opposite of plays. And these 2 poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, were super successful, really super successful. He was really good at it and people really wanted to buy them. And that was at a time when Shakespeare had written really almost no plays. So he was really at the start of his theatrical career. It's really interesting to me that Shakespeare didn't stick with the poetry. As soon as the theatres reopened after the plague, he's back trying to make his mark in the theatre. That seems to me to suggest that this is the milieu that he absolutely loves. And this is the way in which he wants to produce his art. All great art comes actually out of some kind of commercial interaction, because artists, you know, need to eat. And that's an important part of the entertainment element of Shakespeare. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so I'm still thinking about how we might sort of complicate that model of Shakespeare and how he relates to the real world of the Elizabethans who go to his plays. And here, I want to think about Shakespeare's sources. So you may have done some of this already on the play or plays that you're studying. And so you may have become aware that all of Shakespeare's plays, pretty much all of Shakespeare's plays, have at least one really major source. And it's a source in the way that if you did this for your essays, or I did it in an article, this would be plagiarism. It's the kind of source where you've got the book open on your desk and you're just copying it out. It's the equivalent of cut and paste. And Shakespeare's doing a few changes. He's reshaping, but he's very definitely working with pre-existing stories, pre-existing locations, pre-existing names, and all that kind of thing. One of the things I love about the people who wonder whether Shakespeare actually wrote the works of Shakespeare, which is a completely bonkers argument that takes lots of people down some extraordinary rabbit holes. One of the questions is, how did Shakespeare, who we don't think ever went abroad, how did he write The Merchant of Venice? How could he have done that? He'd never been to Venice. Well, The Merchant of Venice is about as much about Venice as something that's not very much about the thing is about it. I can't think what the equivalent is. There's hardly anything about Venice in it. That's one thing. And the second thing is the source that Shakespeare takes is set in Venice. So he just imports it all. There's absolutely no need for him to have gone to Venice to do that. And I think that's an interesting example because it suggests that our models of writing and creativity are a little bit different from the models that pertained in Shakespeare's day. And one way of thinking about this is, I think if you do creative writing, some of you on this call, on this stream, will definitely be writers of your own poetry and fiction, and will go on to do so. If you're doing that in the 21st century, the advice you're most likely to be given is write about what you know, write about what you've experienced, draw on your own experience, or do your research, so that you can talk convincingly. You know, if you're 17 and living in Lancaster, use that. Don't write about being 65 and at the court of King Arthur, or do if you want to, but most people actually are taught early on in their creative writing career to draw on what they know. If you were doing that kind of creative writing sort of MFA in Elizabethan England, of course you wouldn't be because there wasn't such a thing, but if you were doing that, you would have been given quite different advice. The advice would have been, write about what you have read, write about what you've read. That's how you show that you're a writer, because you're engaging with previous writing that is acknowledged to be really good, to give really good models, to give a good steer to a writer, and that part of the pleasure for your audience is knowing the sources like you do and enjoying seeing how you've riffed on them. You know, it's a bit like perhaps it's not quite like doing a cover version in music and then, you know, the enjoyment is what's the harmony, what's the rhythm, what's, you know, but it's something a bit like that. So that's to say, behind Shakespeare's plays is much more a kind of literary heritage than there is a real life inspiration. So sometimes when we look for real life inspirations for Shakespeare, we're just looking in the wrong place, because we're expecting him to be a writer in the 21st century model who is taking on their own experience and transmuting it into their art. Now, I'm sure Shakespeare does do that to some extent. I'm sure he is drawing on people he knows, or, you know, encounters he has had in order to make these conversations in the plays work. But that doesn't that doesn't cancel out, I think, the fact that behind Shakespeare's plays is not generally the inspiration of real life, but the inspiration of previous literary texts. And that sometimes means that what we're getting in Shakespeare's plays is a really literary kind of caricature almost, or a literary tradition, rather than what's happening in Elizabethan London. There's quite a pull backwards. They're quite nostalgic, or they're quite, you know, if Shakespeare's drawing on Chaucer, maybe, for Midsummer Night's Dream that we've got here, we've got a 16th century play which has got some 14th century sensibilities, you know, and Chaucer himself is drawing on previous work. So you can see that that's pulling us backwards away from the contemporary. So that idea that Shakespeare's sources and his inspiration are not the people around him, but the people he encounters in earlier texts, I think is important to bear in mind. There are lots, again, I'm going to keep coming back to this example because I think it's one of the places where we often think about historical context. That's in how women are represented. There are lots of women in Shakespeare's plays who are really much more like the women you meet in plays than the women you might meet in London. And I think that it's important for us to keep that distinction, to keep the sense that these are literary rather than historical figures. Okay, let's keep going. I've touched on this already, but it's worth us just reminding ourselves, because we live in a world of essentially realist drama. That's what television and online Netflix and all that kind of stuff, that's what they've given to us, realist drama. And by realist drama, I mean the context in which it happens is sort of continuous and looks like the real world. It doesn't look like a stage set. It doesn't. It's not pretending one thing is another. If you've got a police drama, it's set in a proper police station and they're wearing proper police uniforms, and there's a proper sense that this is a real three-dimensional world. There's more of it off camera than there is on. That characters are continuous. If there's a mystery about a character, that you explain that psychologically. You say that they're hiding something and we're going to try and find out what that is. And the other feature of realism, I think, in television drama is that the characters within the fiction don't seem to know that we, the audience, are there. So that's, if you're watching a TV drama, the characters very rarely speak direct to camera, do they? And they don't speak out and say, "Oh, what do you think's going on?" It's not a two-way interaction in the way that, say, stand-up comedy is. And I think stand-up comedy might be a better model than contemporary TV drama for thinking about the Elizabethan theatre. And that's to say, a theatre where audience and actors occupy the same space and, crucially, the same lighting. So in a modern theatre, we occupy the same space, we're there at the same time as the actors performing. That's what makes theatre theatre. But usually we, the audience, are in the dark while the spotlight is on the stage. And we, the audience, are encouraged to be quiet. In fact, the other audience members will hiss at us. Certainly, if you've been to the theatre as part of a school trip, you'll almost certainly have had this from sort of hoity-toity theatre goers who've said, shh, stop talking. You've got to behave yourself. The audience in a modern theatre should be as quiet as possible. That's completely different from the early modern theatre, where there was no lighting in the house. Audiences stood up right up against the stage. The characters who were most popular, I think, were the characters on the stage who were most popular were ones who were able to engage, like stand-up comedians, with some heckling or some back and forth with the audience. And as we've come to imagine, moments like soliloquies, those moments where particularly tragic characters and particularly men speak about their inner thoughts, we've come to see that those would have been directed much more obviously out to the audience. So when the Elizabethan Hamlet says, "To be or not to be, that is the question," he's much less likely to be sort of head in hand, in a kind of Rodin thinker kind of mode, all inside himself, and much more likely to be directing himself out to the audience, saying, "Well, help me, guys. What should I do? You can see the situation I'm in." And that kind of rapport with the audience is a really important part of Elizabethan theatre practice. That means that you can never quite forget that you're in the theatre, and nor should you. Your job as an audience member for a Shakespeare play in his own time is to recognise the kind of fluid boundary between the actors on stage and you in your real life, and to recognise that the stage is a kind of privileged space where people can say things and do things that they may not have been able to in quite the same way out in the street. So thinking about the theatre as the moment for these, as the occasion for these dramas, rather than, say, modern cinema or modern television drama, I think is really important. it brings the audience back more actively into the plays. And it means that characters are not so caught up in their own worlds. It also means that the characters, as I said, the characters who speak to the audience are the most popular. And that's why Iago in Othello is much more popular, I think, for audiences than Othello. It's part of the reason why. Iago knows that the rest of the theatre, that the theatre is full of people. Othello seems never to know that there's anybody else watching. So we've just got about 5 more minutes to go. And I just got a couple more of these precepts that I want to bring up. Comedies tend to be more time and place specific than tragedies. Every time I come to this slide, I actually wonder if it's quite true. But what I want to say is that if you're interested in the sort of social world, the social life, the everyday life of the Elizabethans, we're probably a little bit more likely to find that in comedy than in tragedy. And it's partly because tragedy is so over the top, so emphatic, so hyperbolic, we might call it. And tragedy tends to happen in Shakespeare, doesn't it, to higher status people. That's part of the tragic fall is not just a fall from personal or moral greatness, but from a social position, a social rank. Tragedy is a very hierarchical, socially hierarchical world. Comedy is not a working class mode, if that term doesn't quite exist in this period, but it's a world in which there are some more ordinary, more regular people and more of a sense of their kind of households and their interactions. And it's interesting that the Elizabethan theatre was quite heavily, was subject to censorship. In order to put a play on, you had to get the so-called master of the revels, the Lord Chamberlain. You had to get him to sign off and say this play was suitable. And where the Lord Chamberlain interferes in play scripts at this point, it's usually about jokes, comic moments that are not thought to be appropriate, that poke fun at the wrong people. And that's true, isn't it? Still, that one of the places that one of the places of offence in our culture, in our artistic culture, is probably much more about what we think is appropriate for humour or comedy, rather than what we think it's appropriate to be very sort of serious about. So I think comedies have a more immediate relation, perhaps, to the world that produced them than do tragedies. And that might be worth thinking about as you prepare the plays that you're studying. Of course, most people who are doing A-level English literature tend to study tragedies because of a long bias that tragedies are more important than comedies. I actually am coming to think that comedies are probably a little bit undervalued in their ability to speak directly to things of importance in our worlds. Okay, so let's finish up here just by amplifying what I began with. So I began by saying we tend to use the word reflect as our default verb for capturing the relationship between literature, Shakespeare in particular, and its historical context. And I've been trying to suggest some of the ways in which reflection is not really quite the right relationship. Or if it is a reflection, it's in this kind of broken mirror or one of those weirdo fairground mirrors where you're a lot fatter or a lot taller or something than you are in real life. It's a distorting kind of reflection. And that's because, as I've said, Shakespeare is not primarily writing or not writing directly about his own world. So I think instead, if I can just finish my bit by saying, I think instead of saying literature reflects reality or Shakespeare reflects his historical context, we should think about some verbs which are a little bit more oppositional or I've got a little bit more friction in them. So we might say Shakespeare interrogates or questions or subverts or ignores or transforms. All of these are kind of ways, there are lots more you could think about. Have a look at a thesaurus and get a sense of a kind of vocabulary for yourself about how you want to do this important part of the intellectual work of thinking about Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's writing theatre, which is at an angle, always at an angle to the contemporary. It's not completely free from contemporary pressures. No art ever is, but it is transforming the sort of raw material of everyday life in some really interesting ways. And that's the one sort of takeaway that I'd like you to get from my talk. Thank you for listening to that. I'm going to stop sharing and again, come on to take up any questions that have come via the streaming.
Yeah, well, that was wonderful. Thank you, Emma. We've got a few coming through. I think I'll just do them in chronological order as it seems to make most sense. So we've been asked, do you think on a larger level, Shakespeare pushes messages or propaganda even in relation to monarchy? For example, in Richard III, how much do you think he has exaggerated Richard III's villainy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think Shakespeare has exaggerated Richard III's villainy, although he gets that from his source, Thomas More's history. But he's also made Richard much the most attractive and interesting person on the stage. Mm. And I always say, you know, if you were going to, sorry, I'm just a bit distracted because my puppy came in. I was thinking I might go off. Come to Oxford and see puppies, but in fact she's gone running off again. So I always think about Richard III. You know, if you're called for a casting call for Richard III and you weren't Richard, it'd be a disaster, wouldn't it? There's only really one part in this play, and we might feel that Richard is morally morally sort of bankrupt character, and in many ways he is, but he is theatrically completely dominant, and that's one of the ways in which the theatre has a quite different sort of moral status than everyday life. If you were to portray good people, good monarchs, careful, fair, even-handed people, nobody would go to the play. It would just be so boring. So Shakespeare's not really interested in those. All his history plays are about transfers of power or bad monarchs or, you know, things going wrong, because that's where the drama is. So if it's long been said, of course, that Shakespeare's making a statement about the Tudor monarchy in his representation of Richard III, because the man who eventually beats Richard III is the founder of the Tudor dynasty, the dynasty that includes Queen Elizabeth. But that founder, the character of Richmond in Richard III, is such a non-entity that it's really hard to pin all your sort of moral or historical hopes on that. So I think for me, Shakespeare's not really making a message, sending a message about monarchy. He's sending a message about theatre and what's exciting on the stage. But I don't think he is directly towing the line that the Tudors are great, the Tudors are great. That's particularly interesting to him as a dramatist.
Yeah, I totally see that. That's very insightful. Another one then, looking at several Shakespeare plays and his portrayal of female characters, for example, Portia in The Merchant of Venice, would it be correct, in your view, to see him as a proto-feminist?
I certainly think that Shakespeare can write women characters who are very, particularly in comedies, who are particularly active and wanting to who are driving the narrative. Let's say that. So that's one of the differences between comedies and tragedies, I think. In comedies, Shakespeare's comedies, women tend to drive the narrative. In Shakespeare's tragedies, women tend to be collateral for the narrative. They are ways of making it worse for male tragic heroes, rather than characters in their own right. And Portia in Merchant of Venice is a really interesting case, because like many Shakespearean heroines, she dresses as a man, but she's the only one really who dresses as a man and enters a male profession. she is doing it partly to pursue her kind of romantic agenda, but not really. She's doing it to show she as a woman is as good or better a lawyer than anyone else in the Venetian courtroom. So that's a really, it's a really very striking, very striking work. So I think Shakespeare can write female characters who have lots of energy and autonomy and speak up for themselves, but he can also write Ophelia, who doesn't get that chance, or Desdemona, who doesn't get that chance. He's capable of writing the kinds of characters I think that his plots need. But I certainly think that the stage in this period was able to show women in a more across the board in more interesting lights, perhaps than other parts of the sort of early modern world.
Yeah. Okay. And kind of talking about the early modern world, the modern world, I suppose, a good comment to link to again is, now that we have a more digital theatre, do you think this barrier of the fourth wall will be further taken down, kind of on what you were saying earlier about audience interaction at the time of the plays?
That's a really interesting question, because I mean, one argument about digital theatre is that it becomes more fourth wallish, or that the fourth wall is the screen, is our screen, and we're more separated. Audience and actors are more separated. And I think that's one of the sort of experiments that lots of digital theatre has been working on over this closed period. And it depends, doesn't it? I mean, I think what's exciting potentially about where we are in terms of the form is how we will get a digital theatre which is not film, or which is not, so we've had, for example, Live from the NT or RSC Live, those kind of stage productions that have gone to cinemas. We've had that for more or less a decade now. I'm thinking about how that kind of, is that the kind of model for a more digital theatre where the actors are not on stage either? We're all in this, we're all in this virtual world, or are we trying to produce sort of television type drama? So I think I think there are some really interesting questions about digital theatre and how it's going to work. Not least, I think, the question of audience attention. So I think very, very few people have watched digital theatre on screen with the attention that they might have felt they had to give if they were actually there in the theatre.
Right.
Most people get distracted. It's easy, you've got other things. If there's a boring bit, there's always a boring bit in the theatre, isn't there? And if you're sitting in the theatre, you just got to kind of sit through it. You've committed to the production, and unless it's absolutely terrible, you're not going to leave. So you've committed to it, and you have to sort of go through it. Whereas I think if you're watching something on screen, I don't think this is just me, although perhaps it is a kind of a confession. It's very easy to think, I'll just look at this is a bit boring, this bit, I get this, I'm just going to look at my phone. So I've suddenly remembered I've got to look this thing up, or, And I was on talking with the RSC director of digital and some other theatre makers about the future of theatre. And we were talking about, in some ways, the challenge being making theatre for a diminished attention span, whatever medium you want to use.
Wonderful, thank you. Another interesting question I spotted. You're asked, would you argue, therefore, I assume this was asked at the point where you're talking about Othello, that the increase in the number of North Africans visiting London in the 15th and 16th century was not such a large factor causing Shakespeare to write a black character in Othello?
Yeah, that's a really good question, drawing on what I've said. So thanks very much for that. So because it sort of combines, the answer, I think, combines two elements. So first, I talked about Shakespeare's sources, and I said Shakespeare gets this from his source, and he does that in Othello. He takes a story in which a Moor, an unnamed Moor, marries a character called Desdemona, and there is an unnamed ensign who is jealous and plots their downfall. So the Moorish character, the black or Muslim character, more probably meant Muslim first in this period, comes from absolutely comes from the literary text. Now, it's not unlikely that Shakespeare saw the ambassadors from Barbary who visited Elizabeth in 1600, and that may have reminded him of this story of the Moor that he'd read before, and that may have sort of catalyzed this story. So yes, I think we used to say, and this is why this question is important, we used to say there were no black people in early modern England, and therefore, this is an entirely made up scenario. In some ways, that had its uses, because we were able to say, this does not tell us anything about real black people, because it does not come from any position of knowledge or experience. What the work of a brilliant scholar called Imtiaz Habib and others following him have shown us is that there were actually quite a number of black African people doing different things in early modern London, and we can find traces of them in the archives. And that's important because it reminds us of the length of time that Britain has been a mixed country. And that's a really important reminder, because it's a really important strength of our history. But it makes the question of Shakespeare's racism, which I think is a real question in Othello, a bit more difficult to bat away by saying this is just a kind of literary device.
Right, brilliant, thank you. Another question, moving away from Othello. How do you think Shakespeare balances allusion to English folklore and myth, like Childe Roland in Lear, with Christian morality, and how much is there a religious message?
Yeah, really interesting question, and particularly if you're studying King Lear. The more I think about, the more I work on Shakespeare, the less religious I think he is. Now, for some people, the absence of explicit religious material in Shakespeare's writing suggests that he was actually a Catholic who was keeping clear of a very contested and difficult area and just keeping it out of it entirely, because there is almost no other writer of his period who does not write explicitly religious, right? Make sort of use religion explicitly. We did an exhibition in the Bodleian Library in Oxford about how Shakespeare thought about death, and one of the things I realized in going through that was he has very little sense that there's an afterlife, very little sense of the standard Christian comfort that however much we're suffering in this world, I mean, that would be such a theme, wouldn't it, of tragedy? Yeah, it's terrible now, but that what's to come is what will redeem all of this. And there's really, really very little of that. I think people have worked really hard to make Shakespeare more religious, and particularly a play like King Lear, which is explicitly set before the Christian period in Britain, but which writers since A.C. Bradley at the beginning of the 20th century have wanted to see Lear as redeemed, or as redeeming the torments of the play. So I don't think I don't find Shakespeare a very I don't find Shakespeare's philosophy particularly Christian, and certainly not. He does not get his hands dirty with the debates between Protestantism and Catholicism, which are such a feature of this period.
Cool, wonderful, thank you. So I suppose following that, in a way, then talking about the historical context of the period, in your opinion, how important is historical context and the contexts of a production when staging or performing Shakespeare today?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, drama has a particular relation to historical context in that when you put a play on, again, a play from the past, you're always making some kind of connection between the now of audiences. Whenever you set it, or whatever you choose to perform, it will have resonances with the now. I think that those historical moments are really, really important. And I think we can't get away from them. I don't think there is any creative art which is not shaped by its own historical moment. I suppose what I've been trying to argue, though, is that the incorporation of history is often just more nuanced or more elusive than this more sort of straightforward. They're sort of copying off what's happening in real life. So I was doing an interview yesterday about the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's supposed book about Shakespeare, which we haven't yet seen, but Johnson is supposed to be writing a book about Shakespeare. And I was talking about, obviously I haven't read the book, and that's should be a sign not to talk about it. But we were talking about Shakespeare in an age of Brexit.
Right.
Why would you pick Shakespeare to write about? Johnson's last book was about Winston Churchill, so you can see an interesting line there. Why would you pick Shakespeare to write about, and what would you be doing with the sort of great British writer, triumph of the English language, tiny island produces sort of Titanic genius kind of thing? Those things about Shakespeare are all true, and we've said them for years, but there's a very particular shaping to those now, isn't there? If a conservative politician is using that at this time, there is a historical context for now, which I think is really important to think about. Why would this particular version of Shakespeare or of a Shakespeare play work for us now? And so we too are in a historical moment that we need to sometimes try and sort of step back from and be conscious of.
Okay, yeah, I think we're coming to the end of our time. So maybe just one more point on that theme, which I think is very interesting, kind of grafting an old play onto modern contexts, and what you said about Shakespeare staying away from the big religious debate of his time. Do you think that makes him, in a sense, a very universal author, that you can lift him up and put his works in different contexts because he stayed so away from them at the time? But of course he didn't. He did make comments on his own time.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons Shakespeare has lasted so well is that he was never very fashionable. So he was always a little bit out of time, whereas some of his contemporaries who are writing much more clearly about their own circumstance, that hasn't lasted so well. That hasn't had as much to say to other ages. And I think I would sort of hesitate a bit about saying Shakespeare's universal. But what I would say, this sounds like a plug for my book, but it isn't. I'm just acknowledging that this is what I say in the book. In my book, which is called This is Shakespeare, I talk about Shakespeare's gappiness. And I say it's the kind of gaps in Shakespeare which we fill up at different times with different kinds of interpretations. And because the plays are so gappy, they're so kind of incomplete, they can be taken up and reworked and represented for different moments and for different audiences. And that feels to me probably the most important thing about Shakespeare. So I suppose as a sort of final point, that would suggest that the historical context for Shakespeare is always shifting. It's partly the context of the late 16th and 17th century in which he was writing, but it then goes on to be, the sort of subsequent context in which people have made sense, different kinds of sense of his plays for different artistic purposes, for different ideological purposes. And that feels one of the ways that Shakespeare is an absolutely distinctive writer in our literature.
Certainly. Thank you. Well, that's coming to the end of our time, but I don't think you need to apologise for a plug, Emma, because you are one of the eminent Shakespeare scholars at the moment. And I think for those watching, that is what you get when you come to Oxford and do an English degree here. You will meet and interact with and have tutorials with world leaders in their specialised fields. So, Emma, thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thanks everyone for listening, and good luck. This has been a really, really difficult year for all of us. We're really sympathetic to you in your school or college context, and just know that when you come to apply to university, everybody knows that. Everybody knows what's happened, and we will make every effort to compensate for that as we make as we make decisions. I really hope you find it interesting finding out more about Oxford. I absolutely love teaching here, and I love it because we do get to know students well. We've got a really good staff to student ratio, and that's just really, really, really fascinating, getting to know different people and how they read and how they write and how they think.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you, Emma. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you in the next live streams later this afternoon.
Brilliant.